Hello and welcome to this DW News live stream. I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting and we're talking about what's going on in the Middle East after US and Iranian officials said they'd agreed a deal to end the war. Now, it includes a 60-day ceasefire and plans to reopen one of the world's most important oil routes. As Donald Trump was celebrating his 80th birthday with a controversial cage fighting event on the lawn of the White House. We should be able to see those pictures fairly soon. Details of the deal began to emerge, but there are still many questions to answer, and we really want to look at some of those during this discussion, including who appears to be perhaps a winner in all of this and who appears to be a loser. We'd love to know your thoughts. Please do put any of your comments, any of your questions in the chat, and we will put them to our guests, because we've got two great guests coming up a little bit later. We've got Scott Lucas from University College Dublin and our DW correspondent Tanya Kramer, who's in Jerusalem. So do, of course, please put your comments, your questions to them, and we will try to put as many as we can to them as possible. But first, let's just have a bit of a catch-up about what's happened over the past few hours. What we know so far, the details are sketchy, but under the terms of the deal, the Strait of Hormuz would reopen to shipping. Oil prices have already fallen. The US would end its blockade of Iranian ports. Iran says an end to the fighting from Monday night must include hostilities in Lebanon. That's certainly something we will be talking about a little bit later. And talks on Iran's nuclear program would also follow later. Now, the peace deal would be signed in Switzerland on Friday. So let's go now to our first guest. That is Scott Lucas. He is Professor of American Studies at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Great to have you with us. Thank you very much. We always appreciate it that you can give us your time, particularly when we've got a story that's so fast-moving as this is. I guess the first question really has to be how significant you think this agreement is between the US and Iran, and if you think it really is a breakthrough or just a temporary pause.
I think it's always welcome that you get an extension of the ceasefire, which in effect is what this framework deal is. But beyond that, as you mentioned in the introduction, this is very sketchy in terms of what that means. Let me just tick off a few of the points that we could cover. The Strait of Hormuz, for example, yes, I think both sides are saying that it will be reopened. But significantly, the Iranians are saying it will be reopened under their management alongside Oman, the Gulf state, which is to the south of the strait. The Americans are making no reference to Iran having that management position. In return for the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, there are the issues of the easing of U.S. sanctions and the unfreezing of Iranian assets around the world. An estimated $24 billion is what has been mentioned. Again, the Americans don't mention either of those provisions. Then we get to the point of that while the U.S. naval blockade is being lifted on Iranian ports, it's still a bit sketchy in terms of what happens regarding Iranian oil and whether it will be allowed back onto the markets. And I fear that I have to go even farther, and that is that Iran is saying that its nuclear program will not be up for discussion until a second stage beyond this framework deal. The Trump administration has said all along that it wanted the nuclear issue resolved. In other words, an end to Iran's nuclear program. It did not say anything yesterday about the nuclear program in the deal. And then the big issue that I think we will touch upon later is that Iran is saying the ceasefire covers all fronts, including Israel's attacks on Lebanon. The Trump camp does not mention that in its statements. And perhaps more importantly, Israel is rejecting that both on the ground with further attacks this morning and with statements from Israeli ministers.
Yes, a lot that you've just brought out there, and a little bit later we will be speaking to our correspondent who is in Jerusalem and just really finding out what is going on in Israel, particularly with the Netanyahu government. I'll pick up on some of your points in a moment. Just a couple of things. We've had some messages already in the chat. We've had Marcus Lucan, who says, I guess any deal is better than bombs. We've had Psyche Mackin saying, nobody wins in every war that's happened in our entire life. People keep suffering from economic crises that were already caused. And hello to Sifusu, who says hello from the US East Coast, and others who are joining the chat. So great to have you all with us. We appreciate it very much. We're speaking to Scott Lucas, who is Professor of American Studies at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. And Scott was there just telling us the very few things we know about this deal, this agreement, and the many things that we don't really know what's happening. So, Scott, then just picking up on some of that with, you were talking about, for example, we don't know what's going to happen with the unfreezing of Iranian assets, and you talked there about being worth $20 billion, and that is quite key. There has been a lot that has been excluded so far in what we know. Maybe we will get more details coming out. But what do you think stands out most to you about this deal compared to previous attempts at de-escalation?
Well, I mean, the difference between this and what has happened since the initial ceasefire that has occurred on April 7th is that we at least have both sides that they agree on a framework deal, not just simply a ceasefire, but a framework deal, even if it's really vague. And do they actually agree on the same deal? And that's something we wait to see, even as we have this signing ceremony in Friday in Switzerland. I think what stands out to me probably is the significance of this overall compared to where we were on February 26, which is 2 days before the launch of the U.S.-Israel war. On February 26, the Trump camp were in discussions with the Iranian foreign minister. It was mediated by the Omanis. And what was on the table at that point was very severe limits on Iran's nuclear program. It was Iran's ballistic missiles might also come up for consideration. Iran's ties with other groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon might come up for consideration. The Strait of Hormuz, of course, was open at that point. Now, what do we have 3.5 months later? At best, we get back to a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, but the difference will be that Iran actually has gained here because it probably has a significant stake in controlling that waterway. Iran's nuclear program, it looks like, will continue. So the Americans have not closed down the Iranian nuclear program. Iran has not had to discuss its ballistic missile programs, at least from what we know of this framework deal, and it has not had to discuss its ties with those regional groups, Hezbollah and also Yemen's Houthis. In some ways, for all the damage it has taken, and let's not underestimate the fact that Iran not only took severe economic damage, but many people in its leadership, including the supreme leader, were assassinated during this. Politically, it's in a stronger position than it was before when this war started.
So that brings me on to our key question, really, for this discussion. Who do you think are the biggest winners of this deal right now, and who do you think are the biggest losers?
Well, I think one of our kind viewers put in a message I want to amplify. No one wins in a war in that sense. And just want to emphasize almost 3,800 people in Lebanon have been killed since March 2nd. More than 3,000 people have been killed in Iran since February 28th. We've had dozens of people, military and civilians, Israelis who've been killed. We've had 13 American servicemen killed. But if you want to talk about this politically, as I just alluded to, you have a sense that the Iranian regime has not only survived, but it can actually say, look, we have these changes in our position, especially with the Strait of Hormuz, where it has this leverage over the world's energy markets. And that is a big gain here. It can also say that we have actually driven a bit of a wedge between the United States and the Gulf states, at least Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are very, very upset with the Americans over what has happened. Flip that over to the American side, and what can the Trump camp show? I mean, what they were trying to do was to show dominance. They could dominate Iran. They didn't have to talk to them. They could kill the leadership. They could force them to surrender. And all that they have for this after more than 3.5 months is higher prices in the United States, including on gasoline, just a few months before congressional elections, which is what they're paying attention to. They've damaged their relations with allies in the Middle East. And again, I'm looking at the Gulf states. In particular, they have looked like they cannot enforce their dominance in the eyes of the world. And then let's just mention Israel right here, and that is Israel right now as we talk. This is the broader context for your correspondent in a moment. The Netanyahu government fears that it is going to lose when it's on the verge of a victory. And let me just emphasize this to you. Not just with this war in Lebanon, but with the war in Gaza, the Netanyahu government, whether you say it's to defend against Hamas and Hezbollah, whether it's for a greater Israel, whether it's for Netanyahu's personal interest, have been trying to expand their zones of occupation. They have done so in Gaza. They have almost 60% of the territory now. They want 70%. What they wanted in Lebanon was to establish a zone of occupation at least 10 kilometers deep inside the country. What they're fearing right now today is that the Trump folks are going to ditch them and are not going to support that effort. And they especially fear that the Trump folks are going to handcuff them and prevent further attacks on Beirut.
OK, I do want to put some of those points that you've made to our correspondent who is in Israel. But just before we do that, you were there talking, you talked about Iran, you talked about the US as well. From then a US perspective, from a Trump perspective in particular, you know, this deal was made on his 80th birthday. So it was obvious that the White House wanted to get this across the line. But do you think that this is a strategic success for him and for his administration? Or is it a compromise, which I think is what you have been alluding to so far?
It's not just a compromise, it's a shambles. I mean, first of all, let's emphasize Donald Trump does not think strategically. You just alluded to what Donald Trump thinks about. How does this make Donald Trump look? And having gotten himself into this mess, having been able to project this dominance, he now had to get out. And he is going to try to do it with face saving, which is, look at me, I brought peace to the region. Having started the war, look at me, I have prevented Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, even though Iran was not going to get a nuclear weapon. I can explain that in a separate video cast. He's going to try to spin this as some type of personal triumph. But if you realistically look at this in terms of American interests, again, let's just take this off very clearly. What the Trump folks had tried to do, and I mean those real thinkers in the administration, is, look, we're going to remake the Middle East. We're going to box in Iran, and we're going to link Israel with the Arab states, the so-called Abraham Accords. What they have done is they have failed to box in Iran, but perhaps more importantly, they have absolutely sabotaged the Abraham Accords. You now have Gulf states who say they will not pursue this with Israel. I'm talking about Saudi Arabia. I'm talking about Qatar for sure. Bahrain may not. The only Gulf state that's going to work with the Trump folks in Israel on this broad project now is the United Arab Emirates. So amidst this split in the Gulf states, the Trump folks' vision, whatever vision they had of the Middle East from a political strategic viewpoint, is gone. But here's another thing to watch out for. Has Trump damaged his economic stakes in this? The Trump family are pursuing billions of dollars of projects in the Gulf. Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia. They probably keep those projects in the UAE, but have they damaged their economic fortune in Saudi Arabia and Qatar? That probably will be Donald Trump's primary concern rather than U.S. foreign policy.
A very interesting point there. Just before we go to our correspondent, let me just read out a few more comments that are coming in, certainly on YouTube at the moment. And I see that there are some comments also on TikTok. But on YouTube, Dara Doral says, this is an absolute defeat for Trump. His deal is even worse than the Obama deal. Wendy from Brazil says, Santa Cruz is the tag name. Very disappointed. The Trump administration has taken us backwards from the deal that was agreed, or certainly beginning to be agreed under Obama. And Ray W. saying the US has lost Trump's war at a cost of tens of billions of dollars. So the views there in our chat, certainly a lot of animosity there towards Trump and the administration over this. Now, Scott, we were talking a lot there about Israel, and I do think it's very important that we bring in our correspondent who is based there. That's Tanya Kramer, and she has been following the past few months doggedly and is always on call. So we are very, very grateful, Tanya, to have you with us. I know that you got the first call at 1 o'clock this morning, so you've certainly been doing your job a lot over the last few hours. But let me just ask you then what the reaction has been in Israel for when you woke up this morning. I know that was at 1 o'clock, but what was the sort of the feeling that you were getting in Israel with this deal between the Trump administration and Iran, and to which it looks like at the moment Israel has been excluded?
Yeah, well, I think most people here in the region went to bed actually last night and thought there will be rather an escalation than, this announcement of an agreement following Israel's attack on the southern suburbs in Beirut on Sunday. And then, of course, Iran threatened to retaliate. So, a lot of people, the Home Front Command guidelines were changed last night. The Israeli military said there might be the possibility of missiles being launched at Israel. So a lot of people were going to bed with this idea, maybe to wake up in the middle of the night from this. But, many are still, trying to understand what this new memorandum that's going to be signed, expected to be signed on Friday, and a lot of things can happen till then. What is this all about? What's the content of it, and what are the details? And I think we're hearing already, from many commentators here, if you're following the news in Israel, there is a lot of criticism leveled at Netanyahu and at his government. You hear the words of failure. This is a bad deal. There are also those that are saying, well, we have to wait and see because, after this signing of this memorandum, there will be then this period of 60 days where they will hammer out all the details. But what is for sure, there has been a debate already ahead of this decision now to come to this agreement in Israel. And, with a lot of people pointing out that mostly none of these stated goals that Netanyahu stated were actually achieved when it comes to regime change in Iran, when it comes to dismantling the ballistic missile program or the nuclear program, even Iran's proxies in the region. So he, has something to explain to the public here. And while a large majority of Israelis have actually supported the war against Iran that Israel and the US launched, they become also in recent weeks weary of this endless conflict, so to speak. So I think it will be very interesting how this is being explained to them.
Yes, and I do just want to put to you that we're getting in that Israel's defense minister said that Israeli forces, this is talking specifically about Lebanon, actually, which I do want to come to in a moment. But I know, for one, that those on the right of Netanyahu's government have been criticising this deal. What have we actually heard from the Netanyahu government, or certainly from some of those people who are at the top of his cabinet?
Well, we haven't heard yet from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself. That also is, seen here, that he hasn't said anything yet. But we heard, as you said, he was one of the first to come out from Defense Minister Israel Katz. He was mainly speaking about Lebanon, that Israel will not leave what they describe as the so-called security zones. Scott talked about it there, those enlarged buffer zones next to the demarcation line, the de facto border with Lebanon. But he also talked there, they will not leave those zones in Syria and Gaza either. So we heard domestically here also from the opposition. They also have criticized Netanyahu for his failure for this deal, but also because he has, in their eyes, damaged the Israeli-US relationship, because, there have been a lot of angry statements lately from US President Donald Trump. But also we heard from within his coalition, and that is kind of expected, from his finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, saying that this is a bad deal for Israel and the entire free world. But then again, from his Minister for National Security, who always talks in this way, stressing that the Trump agreement does not bind Israel and that Israel is not a subject of the US.
So one question that's come in, Tanya, from Lisby, saying, will Israel abide by the deal?
Well, that is still to see. I mean, especially when it comes to Lebanon. I mean, you know, Netanyahu has a lot of explaining right now to do. You know, there was this atmosphere of euphoria, you know, when Israel and the US attacked Iran in the first days, and that was back in February, March. But since then, you know, especially here domestically, you know, there is this, you know, that people have seen that not everything that Netanyahu said was being done in Iran was actually being achieved. And then there's also this relationship now with the US. We heard yesterday US President Donald Trump again, very angry statements after Israel attacked Beirut again. But what we also haven't seen, I have to say, is that the US has actually you know, taken advantage of its full arsenal to stop Israel to act in Lebanon or, for example, in Gaza. So that also didn't happen. So I think we have to wait and see what's actually in this agreement. And we heard already the defense minister today saying, you know, if Hezbollah doesn't stop, Israel will have the right to attack.
Scott, I'd like to put that to you, that question as well, whether you believe Israel will abide by the deal. Just to add in there that we heard from the Lebanese state-run national news agency, that's NNA, reporting fresh Israeli attacks in southern Lebanon. That's within the last hour.
As Tanya set out so well, because we don't know specifically what's in the deal. We don't know what there is to either abide to or to disregard. But I think in terms of what we are already seeing, you just referred to the reality that Israel is continuing its attacks across southern Lebanon. And I think at a minimum, what you will see Israel doing is establishing what is effectively a zone of occupation. It's very similar to what happened in Gaza. Remember, they have about 60% of Gaza now. They have what they've called their yellow line, about 10 kilometers deep inside Lebanon. I think they will maintain that. I think the question here is whether they go farther, whether they actually move above that yellow line mark to take even more territory for the indefinite future. And then there is the big question, because twice in the past 8 days, the Netanyahu government has defied the Trump administration by attacking Hezbollah positions in Beirut, or what they say were Hezbollah positions in the Dahia suburb of Beirut. Yesterday, because Trump so badly wanted this deal with Israel, he issued what he actually says was an expletive-laden, basically, rant at Netanyahu, telling him how awful this was. Now, I will add a piece of information, and Tanya may know more about this, but I think it's an interesting one. We have not heard from Netanyahu directly himself, but I think we've probably heard from his office under guise of an Israeli source this morning that's gone to the Israeli media. And it's interesting that they blame Donald Trump's two envoys, the son-in-law Jared Kushner and the real estate developer Steve Witkoff. And they say they got too close to Qatar, who were the mediators in this. And they were basically swung by Qatar into accepting what is this bad deal. It is no coincidence that both Kushner and Witkoff's family have financial interest with Qatar as well, which the Israelis know. I think that's interesting because it means that the Israelis have not directly criticized Trump this morning, or at least Netanyahu's office hasn't criticized Trump. But I think they fired a warning shot, which is we are going to come after you politically if we don't get some clarity on this deal, especially if you try to handcuff us from carrying out further strikes against Hezbollah.
Yes, it's some interesting point there that you made about Qatar and the involvement there. And I guess that's the whole point here, that this is so complex. But of course, Scott, we can't forget the fact that, as you said earlier, gas prices have rocketed and people you know, on the streets of the US are feeling the fallout from this, not just the global economy. But I don't know if you want to comment at all on any of that, Tanya, about, you know, the fact that we haven't yet officially, it appears, heard from Netanyahu's office, but we're just getting these dribs and drags and comments from sources, as Scott was saying.
Yeah, there are always the sources that are, coming out from the Prime Minister's office and others. And I think there will be a lot of spin in the next couple of days, how to explain, what has happened here, because this is certainly not what Netanyahu's promised. And we should not forget, we're in the middle of an election campaign. Netanyahu wants to be re-elected or wants to, be also the next Prime Minister in an election that's scheduled for October. So he has a lot of explaining to do here to the public, but also coming back to Lebanon, which I think, a lot of Israelis say, that Israel should have gone all in, whatever they mean by that. And we are not talking here so much about the human toll, what it means for the Lebanese, but these security zones or safe zones, as they're called from a viewpoint from the Israeli side. Obviously, we heard this morning from the defense minister that they will not allow any Lebanese civilians going back there. They will actually also destroy, the infrastructure there, homes there that, what he says, are basically next to the demarcation line that served in what he described as terror outpost. So people will probably not be able to go close to their homes from that side. So I think, Israel tried very much to separate the issue of Lebanon Iran file, but it seems from what we're hearing, at least from Iran, that they were not successful in that. And I think, we have to wait and see how this will play out in the coming days.
Thank you very much, Tanya. I thought it would be interesting to just have a listen to some of the international reaction that's coming out from across the world. We've just picked two in particular. We're going to hear now from the EU's foreign policy chief and Australia's Prime Minister. Let's just have a listen to what they have to say, and then I'd love to get your reactions.
It is much welcomed, and finger crossed that it will be also initialized on Friday, because everybody needs the Strait of Hormuz to be open and actually this war to stop. So it is much welcomed, and we hope that it will last.
We want this agreement to stick because it is in the interests of people in that region to end the military conflict, but it's also in the interests of the entire world, because this conflict on the other side of the world is having an impact here as it is in every single country.
So that was the Australian Prime Minister there saying we want this deal to stick. Do you think, Scott, this deal will stick? I mean, how fragile do you think this agreement is?
This isn't a deal. See, this is the problem. This is merely a framework which opens up negotiations for what would be a deal. We do not have clarity on what the arrangements are for the Straits of Hormuz, Iran's nuclear program, Iran's ballistic missile program. We don't have clarity on the financial arrangements at this point. We may get clarity on some of those points on Friday, but I very much doubt it, because I think the Iranians are effectively saying, we want this confirmed, this confirmed, this confirmed, and American officials say this is all performance related. In other words, Iran will have to do certain things before the Americans will actually confirm their agreement on some points. But let me give you one thing that I'm watching out for in terms of the international reaction to this. You may remember that Donald Trump and indeed his administration were infuriated because they could not get international powers, including European powers, to bail them out of the problem over the Strait of Hormuz, which was open before the war, but now is under Iranian control. If the Iranians continue to manage the Strait of Hormuz, and they want to do that alongside Oman, do the Europeans commit naval forces alongside the U.S. military in the region, or do the Europeans continue to stand aside from this, which will continue to be a measure of isolation for Trump and which will infuriate him even as we talk about these negotiations in forthcoming weeks?
Thank you for that. And I'm just looking at the chat again. And you said, as you said very clearly, this is not a deal. And James California saying nothing signed as of yet. So I think that seems to be very much the view in the chat as we are speaking. Thank you so much, Scott, for your time. Also, thank you to Tanya Kramer, who obviously is very busy there yet again in Israel. Tanya, thank you very much. Scott, thank you very much as well. Very interesting. Obviously, we will be keeping up to date on this particular story, finding out what is happening and whether more develops over the week before the signing of this framework on Friday in Switzerland. Thank you very much for being with me. I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting, and from all the team here, we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.